Good day. Today is Wednesday, 13th August 2025, and as I make this program, the feverish hysteria, if I can call it that, across Europe in advance of the Putin-Trump summit is escalating almost by the hour. We get reports that President Zelensky of Ukraine is rushing to Berlin. The expression rushing to Berlin is not mine, by the way. I read it in the British media today. The intention being that he will be there with Friedrich Merz when the virtual conference is arranged with all of the other European leaders, and of course with the US President Donald Trump, with the Vice President J.D. Vance, who I believe is still in England, also in on the call. So they're all working overtime to try to make sure that, as they put it absurdly, or as the media in the West puts it absurdly, Donald Trump doesn't cross their red lines. Now, this is one of the most ludicrous conceptions I've ever encountered, because if Donald Trump does choose to cross Europe's so-called red lines, if he chooses to cross Ukraine's so-called red lines, what exactly is it that the Europeans who've just signed off on a lopsided trade deal in America's favor, what exactly is it that they're supposed to do? Send Donald Trump rude letters? I mean, I have no idea what exactly it is that they think that they can do which would influence Donald Trump or change US policy, assuming that US policy really was moving in the kind of direction that they're all frightening each other by saying to each other that it is. To repeat a point that I have made in various programs now, but which I also specifically made over the course of a program that Alex and I did on the Duran, the constraints on Donald Trump do not come from Europe, and they certainly do not come from Ukraine. They come from within the United States itself. It is in the United States that the neocons are based. It is in the United States where they have a lock grip on large parts of the federal bureaucracy, the foreign policy bureaucracy, where they control the think tanks and where they receive funding from the military-industrial complex, and where they exercise their paramount influence in the Senate. And yesterday, on the Duran, as it happens, we did a live stream with the US Attorney, Robert Barnes, who is somebody also who is very attuned to the politics, the political developments in Washington. And Robert Barnes explained that one of the reasons that this summit has been organized in the way that it has now in August is because the Senate, the place which is Lindsey Graham's power base, the place which is the institutional voice, if you will, within the American system of the neocons and of the military-industrial complex. To be clear, it is not the only place where they are powerful, but it is what gives them a lock grip. Their control of the Senate is what gives them a lock grip, ultimately, over the US government. It is because the Senate is currently in recess. So Trump, Vance, the other people in the administration who want to try and disentangle the United States from the war, or at least that is what they say they want to do, who are probably conscious of the catastrophe that is developing, the military catastrophe that is developing on the Ukrainian battlefronts, which I discussed extensively in my program yesterday. This is why they are trying to meet with Putin and the Russians now, because they know that come September, their room for political maneuver is going to start to narrow. because the Senate will come back. Lindsey Graham will have the votes in the Senate. He has his friends right across the bureaucracy. When I say he has his friends across the bureaucracy, that's actually a misrepresentation, because it implies that Lindsey Graham is the main actor here, as opposed to being a cog in the neocon wheel. In reality, of course, that is what he is. But anyway, it is in September that this limited window to try to break the deadlock with the Russians, it is in September that it closes. Or at least that is what perhaps the more realist element within the administration fears. That is what Robert Barnes said in the program we did with him yesterday. And it's perhaps worth saying, and in support of his comments, that it's now increasingly clear that the ground for this meeting was more carefully prepared on the American side than appeared to be the case. There were private meetings between the Russians and the Americans. We don't know much about those meetings, but Rubio, the US Secretary of State, has disclosed that they took place. There was private meetings between the Americans and Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. Lukashenko himself has disclosed that those meetings took place. Those meetings were kept secret. And again, the question is, who were they kept secret from? Not the Russians, because after all, it is the Russians that the Americans were secretly meeting. The meetings were being kept secret because whoever it was who had initiated them within the US government, presumably Trump himself, perhaps other people around him, wanted to keep the fact of these meetings secret from people like Graham and Blumenthal and the neocons and the people in the Senate and in the bureaucracy, and above all, in the tightly controlled US neocon media, who, if they did find out that these meetings were indeed taking place, would undoubtedly have thrown a fit about them. So the very fact that we've seen some secret diplomacy take place actually does strongly imply that there have indeed been genuine feelers by the administration towards the Russians, trying to get some kind of meeting organized, probably, unquestionably, in my opinion, in light of the deteriorating military situation in Ukraine, and also because, as I said in various programs, because the bluff, the US bluff, the threat of sanctions, the threat of tariffs, has been collectively called by the BRICS states. In fact, I'm going to suggest that there is another further cause of urgency here. It's not just that the military situation in Ukraine is deteriorating fast. It is that the economic situation is also deteriorating in the United States. As I've already said, industrial production, in many previous programs, industrial production in the United States, in Germany, in Japan apparently also, is starting to curve down. And the reason for that is that industrial producers, high technology industrial producers, are starting to run out of rare earths, because China, since the trade war in April, has been controlling more stringently supplies of rare earths. And this is especially affecting the military industries, but it is to some extent affecting all the others. Now, to be clear, I do not expect US or German or Japanese or European or South Korean industrial production to close down entirely. That is absurd. But the US government must be aware that with high-end, high-tech industry production starting to curve downwards, this is going to create major problems going forward, if only because the current boom in the US stock market, around which so much of the economy depends, the rest of the economy depends, is over-concentrated in the tech industries. So anyway, that's, I suspect, another cause of urgency at this particular time. So the Europeans can talk about their red lines. They can. The concept of red lines, I believe, was set out in an article in, of all places, Bild Zeitung, which is, of course, a German tabloid, but a very powerful German tabloid. They can talk about red lines, but it is not opinion in Europe, in Berlin, in Brussels, in London or Paris, that really concerns Donald Trump or the rest of the administration. It is the political situation in Washington. The administration, Trump himself, precisely because they are there in the executive branch, are probably more conscious of the constraints, the limits that the United States is running into, the weapons shortages, the running down of the inventories, the military crisis on the Ukrainian battlefields, the inability of the United States to take action to reverse or turn that crisis round, the problems in the US industrial economy, the problems in the wider US industrial economy, then the people in the Senate, the people in the National Security Council, probably, the people, the leaders of Europe, Ursula von der Leyen, who's never shown any interest in any of these topics, is probably more aware of these issues than their adversaries, if I can loosely call them that, actually are. They probably sense that the time window to try to unblock all of these problems is closing, and that's why we've had this summit meeting now on Friday in Alaska. Now, what makes all the talk about red lines from the Europeans even more absurd is that the Trump administration has gone out of its way to say that there is not going to be a deal done between the United States and Russia in Alaska. Now, I fully expect that that is true. We've had proposals circulating that the Russians cease fire in return for a Ukrainian commitment to pull out of Donbass with a freeze of the front lines in Zaporozhye and Kherson. It's not clear whether the Russians ever did make or agree to that proposal. I've already set out my view. I think that is probably an American proposal. We see that the Americans are talking about land swaps. It's important to say that so far, all of these ideas that we see spinning around, Ukrainian withdrawals from Donbass, freezing of the front lines in Zaporozhye, Kherson, Ukrainian pull-out of Donbass, land swaps, ceasefires in the sky. All of these ideas are coming from the Americans. They are being circulated in the American media. The Russians so far have not spoken about or commented upon any one of them. officially, their position remains exactly the same as it was before. Putin only recently spoke about how the proposals that he set out, the conditions that he set out on the 14th of June 2024 at the speech to the Foreign Ministry remain the same. He said that over the course of his meeting with Lukashenko at the Valam monastery. He said that these are not just conditions, they're also goals that the Russians aim to achieve the full range of objectives that they set themselves, and which Putin outlined in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. He went out of his way over the course of that meeting in Valam at the monastery to reiterate that that is the position. And I have not seen a single comment, a single suggestion appear on any Russian media site that has any connection at all to the Russian government to suggest that the Russians are retreating from that position. Now, Putin did very interestingly say that they are not just conditions, they are also goals, the things that he set out at his at his speech to the Foreign Ministry of the 14th of June 2024, and that he did say, and he has said many times, that if the Russians can achieve these goals through diplomatic action, as well as in place of military action, then they're prepared to seek that kind of diplomatic action. So that does allow a certain measure of flexibility. This is why I don't exclude the possibility that the Russians might agree to a ceasefire if the Ukrainians commit to pulling out of Donbass and leave the situation in Zaporozhye and Kherson to be sorted out later. But I absolutely do not think, and I don't think there is any possibility whatsoever, that the Russians are going to give up their claims to the entirety of Zaporozhye and Kherson, or to any of their other claims about Ukraine's NATO membership, its long-term neutrality, its non-status position, the limits on the size of Ukraine's military, the issues about the status of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, the importance of elections in Ukraine to establish the long-term government of that country. Because remember, Putin doesn't consider Zelensky to be a legitimate president of Ukraine at this time, because he considers that Zelensky's status is a constitutional anomaly. Denuclearization of Ukraine as well. This is also a long-standing Russian demand. The elimination of the influence of the radical nationalist element from Ukrainian political life. I'm engaging in euphemisms here, but you all know what I mean. Anyway, I've seen no sign that the Russians are prepared to back off any of that. But if the Ukrainians withdraw from the major fortified line in Donbass, if they give up the chain of cities, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, they're about to lose Pokrovsk. Saving the Russians the trouble of having to capture them, then the Russians might say, I'm not saying they will say, I can imagine that the Russians might say that they're prepared to agree a temporary ceasefire on that basis, contingent on the progress of negotiations to achieve all of those further goals. And in the event that that were to happen, I can also imagine that the Americans and the Russians might move forward, as various commentaries in the European media have been suggesting, that there would be phase one, which would be the ceasefire that I've discussed. Phase two, the follow-up meeting that Ushakov has talked about in Russia between Putin and Trump to take the process forward. And at that point, we might start to see movement towards a diplomatic settlement. But as I said, I don't think that we're going to get any agreements to that effect at this meeting in Alaska. We are probably going to have Trump and Putin bounce some of these ideas off each other. The Russians will undoubtedly seek harder terms. Probably they've said that they would be willing to consider some of these ideas about a pullout by the Ukrainians of the Donbass and a further ceasefire. But as I said, we're far from a deal, and Trump and his officials have already said that there is not going to be that kind of a deal at the meeting in Alaska. So again, coming back to what I'm saying, I am somewhat bewildered what exactly it is that the Europeans are getting so angry and so worked up about. Well, I'm actually going to say what it is, because it's absolutely obvious if you read and listen to European commentaries. What they're really objecting to is not that the Americans and the Russians might move forward to a deal on Friday. It is that the Americans and the Russians are meeting at all and are exchanging ideas with each other. As far as the Europeans are concerned, it's absolutely wrong. It is outrageous that the Americans should have discussions with the Russians. How many articles have you read, if you are following the media, the mainstream media? How many commentaries have you heard in which it's spoken about how dangerous it is for Donald Trump to meet with Putin, that Putin is this enormously clever, insinuating, manipulative individual. He's got all the facts apparently at his fingertips. That's about the one point they do say about Putin, which is actually true. He has this extraordinary ability to bend Donald Trump to his will. It's incredibly dangerous to meet with this man, at all. Far better that Donald Trump never does so, because if he does, like some kind of Svengali figure, Vladimir Putin is going to somehow influence him and turn him round to his side. And there's a long lament today in the Financial Times about the fact that Trump is going to be meeting with Putin in Alaska without any experts present. And the contrast that is being made is with the previous summit meeting between Putin and Trump, the one that took place in Helsinki back in 2018, when supposedly Trump did turn up with experts. The experts in question being, of course, none other than John Bolton and Fiona Hill, two neocons. In the case of John Bolton, one of the most belligerent, aggressive, manipulative, dangerous individuals that I can imagine. Somebody who has never seen a war that he doesn't want to join and is constantly scheming and agitating and demanding that the United States involve itself in yet further wars, and somebody who not only never seeks to avoid confrontations, but who, on the contrary, appears to relish them. Anyway, those two people, John Bolton and Fiona Hill, are the two people that the Financial Times thinks it was a wonderful thing that Donald Trump had with him when he met with Putin in Helsinki. And it's a great shame, a tragedy that he doesn't have people like that surrounding him now. Well, not only that, can I just say, the Financial Times, and by the way, the Financial Times, as I said, actually quotes, it has quotes from John Bolton and Fiona Hill talking about this forthcoming summit meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska. So they're actually referenced in that article. But the Financial Times also talks about how Donald Trump, over the last few months, has purged the National Security Council and the State Department of many of its experts. So supposedly he is going into this meeting without any expert advice from all of these experts. Again, it seems lost from the Financial Times that these are the same experts who brought the relationship between the United States and Russia to the very point of crisis in which they are in now. Of course, the Financial Times will object that it was entirely Putin's fault that we are in this crisis. It's the unprovoked war of aggression that Putin launched that somehow brought this about, extending NATO eastwards, all of that had nothing to do with it. But of course, others, myself, take a completely different view. And I would suggest that the fact that the Financial Times and other media outlets in the West, the predominant body of opinion in Europe that looks at all of this, that they lament so much that these hardline, ultimately confrontational, belligerent neocons, the people who, as I always say, have no reverse gear, that they are not there. Well, that tells us all you need to know about the perspectives of things in Europe. And as for the fact that these people are not there, that they're not going to be creating all that trouble in Alaska that they created at the previous summit meeting in Helsinki, I personally would say what a huge relief. Now, speaking about that previous meeting in Helsinki, every single media commentary that I read in the media, the mainstream media, all trots out again the point about how over the course of the press conference in Helsinki, Trump appeared to side with Putin over his intelligence agencies about Russian interference, supposed Russian interference in the 2016 election. Never mind that if you go to the actual text of the press conference, you will see that actually Donald Trump didn't do any such thing. The point is that if Putin denied that Russia had interfered in the 2016 election, well, we now have multiple reports and disclosures that suggest that he was telling the truth. These commentaries, which are all over the place, in the Financial Times, that same article in the Financial Times that I was talking about, articles that appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, the Telegraph, that are all over the German media making this identical claim. It's as if the Mueller report, the Durham report, the various reports by Michael Horowitz in the United States, all of which taken together basically demolished the entire Russiagate narrative. It's as if all of those reports had never been written and had never been published. Notice that none of these articles ever cite or reference them. It's as if the Gabbard disclosures that are now underway, which cast doubt on the famous intelligence community assessment of January 2017. It's as if those disclosures had not happened. It's as if we have no more information now than we did in 2018. That information we had in 2018 about the Russiagate narrative was obviously false then, just saying. But anyway, whatever, as I said, we've had all of that evidence since then, which, to say it generously, casts massive doubt on that Russian gate narrative. But, well, we see all of these media outlets, they continue to trot it out as if it was true. It is incredible that this should happen in the way that it continues to happen in the media. And it's incredible because it also reflects the fact that, at least at a governmental level in Europe, because all of these media outlets, the ones in Europe, obviously reflect what is the entrenched official view, the belief of all European governments. Just to say, they continue privately to subscribe to the Russiagate narrative, even if they pretend otherwise, even if they publicly say otherwise. Anyway, it's as if nothing that has been said, no investigation, no evidence provided will ever make them change their views about it. But it gets worse because, of course, they continue also to misrepresent the way in which this summit meeting has come about. So, proper reporting of the summit meeting in Alaska would acknowledge the reality that this is a meeting that the Americans have sought, and that these ideas about land swaps, about ceasefires based upon Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass, about ceasefires in the sky as discussed by Lukashenko over the course of his visit to Russia and his meeting with Putin at Valam Monastery. All of these ideas are ideas that are being floated by the Americans. There is no doubt about this. In the case of the ceasefire in the sky, we know this because, as I discussed in a recent program, Lukashenko himself said this. He said the Americans that he spoke with put this idea to him, and he said that they should take it up with the Russians, and he thought there was a chance that the Russians might respond to it positively. All of this is disregarded because, of course, it goes against the narrative, the current narrative, which is that the Russians have begged for this meeting in Alaska because they feel themselves to be in a weak position. They wanted this meeting because they were worried about the sanctions and the tariffs that Donald Trump was threatening, and that Trump was very reckless, extremely unwise to have this meeting because, coming back to the point I was making previously, it's likely that he will be influenced in some wicked way by Vladimir Putin to change the course that he was previously taking towards imposing these massive sanctions and tariffs on the Russians. Again, all of these media outlets, and again, it's also clear that this is the line that European governments are taking, is that it was the Russians who sought the meeting, but it is the Russians who are floating these ideas about Ukrainian withdrawals from Donbass and ceasefires and all of those things, when, as I said, on the contrary, all of the evidence that we have shows, I think, fairly conclusively that these ideas, in fact, and that they are only ideas. Let me stress again, these are only ideas that are being floated, that are being bounced around, that all of these ideas are coming from the Americans. So, there it is. They don't want the Americans and the Russians to meet. They don't want the Russians and the Americans to bounce ideas off each other. They're doing everything they possibly can to make sure that when the meeting on Friday takes place, all that the Americans do is repeat the same positions that the Americans and the Europeans hammered out together back in the spring. There's no idea of concessions, no acknowledgement of Ukraine's failures on the battlefields, no acknowledgements of the problems with the sanctions and of the tariffs. Far better that Trump wasn't meeting with Putin. Far better that he simply imposed the sanctions and the tariffs and continued to arm Ukraine. Far better that he went back to following the policies that Joe Biden followed. And if it all fails, if Ukraine is defeated, well, there's a simple way for the Europeans to get out of the problems that causes, which is to blame him, blame Donald Trump. Anyway, this is, in my opinion, what we're going to see basically come out of the meeting that's going to take place today, the meeting between the Europeans and Donald Trump. I don't know what Donald Trump really expects from this meeting. He said, I think somewhat ironically, that these are wonderful people who want to deal. My own view is that on this occasion, at least, Trump is being ironic. He doesn't believe that these people are wonderful people. And in fact, he's made that fairly clear many times. And he absolutely must know by now that they don't want to deal. But anyway, he's going to meet with them. Vance, as I said, will be joining in the call, and we will see how it goes. Now, I said yesterday that the claims that were circulating across the media in London that Zelensky had agreed to make enormous concessions, that he'd agreed that Ukraine would cede territory to Russia, that this was simply untrue, that all that Zelensky was doing, all that Zelensky had done, was that he had proposed, or rather that he had reiterated, Ukraine's long-standing demand that there be an unconditional ceasefire on the existing contact line, that the Russians would be able, for the time being, to hold on to the territory that they control, but this would not be the long-term outcome of the war, that ultimately Ukraine would still expect all of that territory to be returned to itself. Well, as it happens, over the next couple of hours, Zelensky made further statements which made his stance completely clear, and it is the one that I set out yesterday. He ruled out all Ukrainian withdrawals from Donbass. He ruled out any Ukrainian withdrawals from any territory whatsoever. He continued to make clear that he stands by his demands about Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. He rejects land swaps. He's saying all of these things. I'm sure he will say them over the course of the meeting today. I suspect, by the way, that he, rather than Merz or Starmer or Macron or any of the others, is going to do most of the talking with respect to Donald Trump. He is apparently mortified that he's not going to be in Alaska on Friday, just as I think it's entirely a good thing that all of those terrible experts, so-called experts, Fiona Hill, John Bolton, and their soulmates from the National Security Council and the State Department are apparently not going to be there. So I think it is an excellent thing that Zelensky is not going to be at the meeting in Alaska, and that the Europeans also are not going to be at the meeting in Alaska. If they were all there, the meeting would go nowhere at all, just to say, because to repeat again, these people do not want the Americans and the Russians talking to each other. Anyway, Zelensky is going to be mortified about the fact of his absence, and he's going to repeat again his long-standing, unchanging positions that all Ukraine's territory is Ukraine's territory. It should all be returned to Ukraine. Ukraine might, as a fact of military necessity, except that for a certain period, the Russians can continue to occupy, as he puts it, this territory. But as far as he is concerned, it remains Ukrainian. And he is not prepared to concede a millimeter of it, either in the meeting today or in any other place. And Zelensky has said something which is actually extraordinary. He says that any agreements reached by the Americans and the Russians on Friday in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, which are not agreed by Ukraine, are illegitimate. That they have no standing, that if the Americans and the Russians come to some kind of agreement with each other, that is simply a bilateral agreement between Russia and the United States. It doesn't concern Ukraine. Well, this would be an impressive stance if it really had any force behind it. But the reality is that Ukraine is fighting the war with American weapons. Ukraine has been fighting the war with intelligence provided by the United States. It is also the reality that the United States has, until very recently, provided Ukraine with most of its funding. To argue that the Americans have no right to talk with the Russians about how to end the war, or to come to agreements with the Russians about the future direction of the war, and that Ukraine can proudly disregard all of these agreements, is delusional. It's not just delusional, it is ultimately insulting of Ukraine's primary paymaster and patron, which is, of course, the United States. But that, of course, is what Zelensky is saying. That is what the Europeans are going to support him in saying as well. That's what you're going to see appear in all of the media articles, the commentaries, the editorial pages across the West, that the Americans and the Russians have no right to talk to each other. And if they come to any understandings with each other that concern the war in Ukraine, well, that is a betrayal of Ukraine. Now, again, as someone who remembers the Cold War, I have to say that this is not how it was done during the Cold War. I remember that there were many, many proxy wars during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Americans and the Soviets regularly met with each other to talk about them. They had discussions, many discussions about the war in Vietnam, for example. I can remember that the US and the Soviet Union had intense interactions during that time. Kissinger used to meet Gromyko. Nixon used to meet Brezhnev. There were also private communication back channels between Kissinger and the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin. Of course, they didn't just talk about Vietnam, but they talked about many other things. But they did talk about Vietnam. And it was the case that in the run-up to the agreements that were reached in Paris, the Soviet Union did express a view and made it very, very clear to the North Vietnamese that it did want the North Vietnamese to come to an agreement with the Americans. So It's absolutely the case that in the war, the conflict in Vietnam, the United States and the Soviets came to understandings with each other. The Soviets made known their opinions to the North Vietnamese, and of course the Americans made known their opinions to the South Vietnamese also. And of course this reproduced itself in every other big proxy conflict in during the Cold War. Again, I can remember the intense interaction that took place at the time of the Yom Kippur War in 1973 between Israel and the Arab states. The Soviets were backing the Arabs. The United States was backing Israel. Again, Gromyko and Kissinger were in close contact with each other throughout that conflict. The Soviet Prime Minister of the time, Alexei Kosygin, was in Egypt. We didn't know it at the time, but we found out about it later. And he was coordinating and giving, in fact, instructions to the Soviet Union's Egyptian ally at that time. Soviet and American diplomatic action, bilateral diplomatic action, was critical in brokering the ceasefires, the various ceasefires that ended the 1973 war. And, well, one can find lots of other examples of this. But no, today that is absolutely unacceptable, at least if you listen to the Europeans, if you listen to the Ukrainians, if you follow the narrative line in Washington. It's wrong. It's inappropriate for Donald Trump to meet with Vladimir Putin. As I said, Vladimir Putin is Svengali. Donald Trump is a dunce, apparently. That's the narrative. It's not being put in relation to Trump quite that strongly, but the Financial Times article all but calls him a dunce, just to say. It's completely wrong, completely inappropriate for the leaders of the two nuclear superpowers to meet and to have a discussion about a proxy conflict which the West is losing and which has at various times shown real possibilities of spiraling out of control. Now, I've discussed this all at length, and perhaps I've spoken too much and too long about this, but I think that it is important to say these things. Far from the meeting in Alaska being a departure from classical diplomacy, it is the stance of the Europeans and of the neocons and of the various commentators in the Western media, of all of the critics of that meeting. It is they who are departing from established practice as it was sorted out during the Cold War. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. We will see what does come out of this meeting today. Not very much, I think. I don't think Donald Trump is really in much of a mood to concede anything. Merz apparently is going to demand that he goes ahead with the sanctions and the tariffs. I don't think Trump will do any such thing, certainly not ahead of the meeting in Alaska. I think that the Americans have a clearer understanding of how fragile the situation for them is. And I think for that reason, that's why they've called this meeting, and that's why they want to at least establish some kind of a dialogue with the Russians now. Now, what I will just discuss briefly is what the Russians themselves are looking to get from this meeting. I think if the Russians are offered a proposal whereby the United States puts pressure on Ukraine to pull out of Donbass, the Russians, for the reasons I said, might accept a ceasefire in that case. It puts them in a stronger position. I don't believe, however, that they expect long term that the Americans really are going to concede all their various demands. And I don't myself think that they expect the diplomatic interactions with the Americans to end the war. The Russians are confident that they're winning the war. They're confident about the state of their economy. I will discuss that shortly. They are confident in the firm stance taken by their allies. If the Americans sense that their cards are weak, the Russians know that their cards are strong. So why then are the Russians interested in meeting with the Americans in Alaska? I come back to that point, which I've discussed many times, and it really relates to that piece that was written some months ago by Eve Smith, which is that when the war is won, the Russians are going to face a whole set of problems. If there is a collapse in Ukraine, or rather when there is a collapse in Ukraine, if the Russians cross the Dnieper, if they take Kiev, if they establish themselves as the dominant power in Eastern Europe again, looking forward, it makes much better sense for them to have some kind of long-term dialogue going on with the Americans, rather than find themselves in an open-ended conflict with the Americans in Europe. So they want to control the outcome of the war so that if victory comes, it is a victory that will bear fruit for them. Or maybe I should say, when victory comes, it is a victory that will bear fruit from them. They want their victory to be recognized. And they understand that for that to happen, they need a dialogue with the United States. So that's why they are meeting with Trump in Alaska. They then want the follow-up meeting to happen in Russia. They want a long-term dialogue with the United States. They probably want to resume discussions about nuclear arms control. If they can interest the Americans in joint projects in the Arctic, why not? Ultimately, what the Russians want is peace for themselves in Europe, not a return to the kind of confrontation that they had to live through during the Cold War, one which will tie down Russian resources and which will interfere with their pressing concerns to develop and build up their own economy and their own society and to improve its material conditions. And yes, of course, the Russians know the previous agreements that they reached with the Americans didn't work out in the end, that the Americans backed off them. But they sense that they're in a position of advantage, and I'm guessing that they probably calculate that if they do deals of the kind that I've described with the Americans now, then they're in a strong enough position to enforce them for the next 5 to 10 years. And if it all falls apart beyond that, well, Russia will be able to make use of those 5 to 10 years to build up its economy and its society, and to gain critical mass, and to become a much richer and more prosperous country, and a much more secure country anyway. They are closer to that point than I think is widely realized. I read an article recently. I can't remember who wrote it, but the article made the point that if you look at economies on a purchasing power parity basis, then Russian per capita GDP is now not only much higher than that of all of the other BRIC states, including China, by the way, but that it has now drawn level and overtaken per capita GDP in some West European countries, Italy, for example. And it is not that far short of even some of the richer, supposedly richer, West European countries, like Britain, for example. So the Russians, whose economy is on an upward trajectory, can probably say to themselves, look, if we can get those 5, or better still 10 years of peace, we got lots of investments and projects underway. We've got a massive project to develop our chip industry, for example. We've got other projects as well. I was reading about projects to build gas turbines, for example. Our aerospace industry is busy. Most people are not aware of the fact, always discussions about AI technology focus on China and the United States, but Russia actually does have an active AI program, a development program. They take AI extremely seriously and they're investing in it heavily. They're already well advanced in nuclear power engineering. Their debt levels are low, so probably they will say to themselves, give us 5-10 years and then we will be strong enough to deal with whatever threats the West might plan to throw at us in future. By that point, we will simply be too strong. So you could see what the Russians might be thinking. And by the way, what I've just said about their perspectives is not far-fetched. If you follow the Russian media, if you follow Russian commentaries, you can see that they talk about precisely these sort of things quite a lot. And that brings me to perhaps the more concrete news, which is what's actually going on the battlefronts and what's going on in the Russian economy as it happens. Firstly, if we're talking about the battlefronts, well, there's been very little additional news over the last 24 hours. In the previous days, we'd had a cascade of reports talking about a massive breakthrough by the Russian army in the Pokrovsk area. Last night, Radovka, the Russian newspaper, which has been providing information pretty reliably, said that the Russians have continued successfully their advance in the Pokrovsk area, that village that they needed to capture, or that they reached, the village of Zolotoy Kolodyaz, has indeed now been fully captured by the Russian army. There are also reports, very panicky reports from Ukrainian sources, which spoke about Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups having infiltrated into the small town of Dobropilya itself. There was even a photograph that was posted by someone which purported to show a Russian reconnaissance group operating right in the center of Dobropilya, moving around some sort of big garage type of facility. I'm not quite sure what it exactly was. But anyway, reports appearing all over the place yesterday, last night, which appear to confirm a lot of the information that we've been getting over the previous 24 hours about the Russian breakthrough. And interestingly enough, there was actually some footage of fighting which appeared yesterday in Rodinsk itself. It's clear that the Russians have indeed broken into Rodinsk, and it looks as if the Russians have indeed captured the two mines which lie immediately east of Rodinsk, the Krasny Liman mine and the Dimitrov mine. Or at least, if they haven't captured those mines, they probably captured most of the territory of the mines, and any Ukrainian troops who are still on the mines are in effect surrounded. There's also further reports that the Russians now control a significant section of Mirnograd. This is the detached eastern suburb of Pokrovsk, and that they are in fact in control of perhaps 30% of Mirnograd. But again, there's little footage to confirm that yet. It seems that the Russians have indeed captured Udachny, the village to the southwest of Pokrovsk. Again, I haven't seen footage of this, but this appears to be acknowledged, or at least I've heard that this has been acknowledged by Ukrainian sources. And the reports which I spoke about yesterday, or at least a couple of days ago, about the Russians having reached Shevchenko. There are some claims that they are attacking Shevchenko, a village to the southeast of Dobropilye. That those reports apparently are true, and that the Russians have indeed advanced further still and have cut all of the various roads, or at least have established control over all of the various roads in this area. So we've had some corroboration, some video footage, and some corroboration of all of these various claims that we were hearing being talked about yesterday. The other thing that we are hearing is that the Ukrainians are now rushing reinforcements to this area. Apparently, one of the two Azov brigades, there are now two Azov brigades, the 3rd Azov Brigade and the 12th Azov Brigade. And by the way, just to say, these two brigades are in conflict with each other. The commanders of these two brigades detest each other. The 12th Azov Brigade, by the way, appears to be commanded by the command team of the Azov Brigade, whom the Russians captured in Mariupol, and which they then handed over to Turkey, following pledges that these people would not participate further in the war, violating his promises to the Russians. Erdogan released these people to Ukraine, and of course they immediately reformed their own brigade, the 12th Azov Brigade, which appears to be in conflict with the other original Azov Brigade, the 3rd Azov Brigade. I am not going to waste time in this program discussing the disputes and arguments between the two brigade commanders and the purported differences in their ideologies and outlooks. I think this is a complete waste of time. Anybody who's interested in that kind of thing can explore it for themselves. You can find various references to it on the internet. Anyway, suffice to say that contrary to what I said yesterday, it is not the 3rd Azov Brigade that is being redeployed by the Ukrainians to the Pokrovsk area. It is the 12th Azov Brigade, the Mariupol, the brigade led by the Mariupol people, that is being redeployed to the Pokrovsk area. And apparently various other elite or semi-elite formations of the Ukrainian army are being redeployed in that direction also. We've had confirmation of this, again, from Denis Pushilin, the head of the Russian-backed Donetsk regional government. He says Pokrovsk is now a focal point for everyone, especially ahead of the upcoming meeting between Russian President Putin and US President Trump in Alaska. This area is receiving particular attention. The enemy is transferring more forces, including units, as he puts it, of the Azov battalion. Well, it used to be a battalion, it's now brigades and all of that. However, they have reason to fear because our unit's successes are clear. And then Pushilin, and I'm taking all this from TASS, said that Ukrainian military logistics in the area have been compromised, making their forces withdraw from well-equipped positions to less prepared ones. And Igor Kimakovsky, an advisor to one of Pushilin's advisors, has apparently also told TASS that Ukrainian troops are almost practically unable now to withdraw from Pokrovsk. Now, I'm not sure what all of these redeployments by the Ukrainians to the Pokrovsk area will do. I've heard reports that the breakthrough forces that the Russians deployed north of Pokrovsk number around 1,100 men, which is certainly more, by the way, than would be the case if we're talking only about sabotage and reconnaissance groups. We're talking about infantry, light infantry. But the Russians are said to have 110,000 troops in the area. Probably that's enough to consolidate control and to counter these Ukrainian reinforcements. One wonders how big these reinforcements are. And by the way, I also wonder about how stable a unit, the 12th Azov Brigade, actually is, considering that it is actually a relatively recent brigade. Just saying. But anyway, we will see whether the Ukrainians are able to stabilize the situation over the next couple of hours or days, or whether the Russians counter whatever counter moves the Ukrainians themselves are taking, and what exactly does happen. Anyway, there were some extraordinary reports of claims yesterday. Reports which said that not only is the garrison, the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk, now practically in a cauldron, but that if this cauldron is closed tight, then we are not talking about hundreds or even thousands of Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk. We could be talking about tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk. I even heard a report that says that we would be looking at 15,000 men in total surrounded in Pokrovsk and in the areas just around it. Now, if that is true, and Ukraine were to lose 15,000 men in this battle, either killed or captured, as we saw in Mariupol, that would be a terminal disaster for Ukraine. We would be looking at a disaster absolutely on the scale of the encirclement of the Ukrainian army in Debaltsevo in 2015. Given the critical manpower shortages of the Ukrainian army at this time, given the shortages of trained infantry, the critical shortage of trained infantry, the loss of 15,000 men in a single battle would be a loss which I doubt Ukraine would be able to absorb. It would be a disaster. Well, it would be a disaster that would probably undermine, terminally compromise Ukraine's continued ability to continue the war. In 2022, with Ukraine mobilizing 700,000 men over the course of just a few weeks, Ukraine could have absorbed a loss of 15,000 men in a single battle. It cannot afford to lose a force of that size now. Just saying. Having said that, I don't know that there are indeed 15,000 men trapped or almost trapped in Pokrovsk. I remember that during the battle for Mariupol, there were many claims that around 20,000 Ukrainian troops had been trapped in Mariupol. And it may be that the Ukrainians did have a force of something like that size in Mariupol at one point in the fighting there. But eventually, when the Ukrainian troops in Mariupol surrendered, when they were pushed to the Azovstal factory and surrendered, from my recollection, the total number who surrendered was not 20,000, but somewhere around between 2,000 and 2,500. So one should treat with some skepticism some of these claims about tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops trapped in Pokrovsk and of a cauldron of that size. But then, it may be that this is a different situation now. It could be that the encirclement of Pokrovsk has happened so fast that the Ukrainians have not been able to pull most of their troops out of Pokrovsk. It may be that the encirclement of Pokrovsk has been more complete than I had realized. We'll just have to see. Now, just to say very quickly, there's been more news that the Russians are close to breaking Ukrainian defenses in the Liman-Siversk area. It seems that not just Kolodizy, but also Torske, the two villages between Liman and Siversk, are indeed now under Russian control. And the Ukrainians are now also acknowledging street fighting taking place in Kupiansk, and they seem to be doing it in a way that suggests that they expect Kupiansk to fall, resistance there to collapse, perhaps over the next few days. But I'm not going to devote more time to discussing the situation on the battle lines. Pokrovsk remains the main battle. There is also, by the way, considerable fighting in the Konstantinovka area. I ought to have said that the 12th Azov Brigade has apparently been transferred to the Pokrovsk area from Konstantinovka. So, of course, the Ukrainians are again juggling forces around. And the transfer of a whole brigade from Konstantinovka to Pokrovsk and of other units apparently defending Konstantinovka almost certainly is going to accelerate the collapse of Ukrainian defenses around Konstantinovka as well. For the record, I believe that the Russians are now in control of all of the territory to the south of the Kliban-Bek reservoir, except for the village of Kliban-Bek itself. And I don't think there are many Ukrainian troops left in that village either. Anyway, that's, as I said, for another day. There is one thing I do want to quickly say, which is that there's been a big narrative which has been built up over the last couple of months about how the Russians have developed this new infiltration tactic of sending small groups of infantry to weave their way through Ukrainian defense lines, and that this isn't something that has been done in the war before. and that it's somehow original to what the Russians are doing. I just wanted to say that this is actually untrue. Infiltration tactics of this kind have been used before in this war. The Ukrainians used exactly these same infiltration tactics during their Kharkov offensive in the autumn of 2022. And they did so very successfully. The reason why infiltration tactics succeeded when they were used by the Ukrainians in the autumn of 2022, and why they have succeeded now that they're being used by the Russians north of Pokrovsk, is the same. A shortage of defenders to defend the territory. The Russians were trying to defend a large area of Kharkiv, the towns of Kupiansk, Izium, and Balakleya, with a force of about 5,000 men, which was nowhere near enough. That figure is now, by the way, largely accepted. The Ukrainians are critically short of men altogether across the conflict line. When there are insufficient troops to create a continuous defense line, then the situation lends itself to infiltration. And that's what we saw during Ukraine's Kharkiv offensive of the autumn of 2022. And it is what we're seeing north of Pokrovsk now. Just saying, just a little point of detail which I wanted to make. Now, I talked about the Russian economy. As it happens, Vladimir Putin has had a meeting, I believe it was in the Kremlin, to discuss the state of the economy. In fact, it was in the Kremlin, and all of the various important people were there. Mishustin, the Prime Minister, Oreshkin, the person who was previously economics minister and who is now Putin's major economic advisor, the economics minister, Reshchnikov, the finance minister, Siluanov, and, of course, the governor of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina. They were all there, and they carried out an overview of the situation, and they discussed the budget for next year. And Putin seemed to be relatively satisfied with the overall state of the economy. And these were his words. I suggest that we discuss the state of affairs in the domestic economy in general and its main trends. This year, the government and the Bank of Russia faced a joint task of returning the Russian economy to a trajectory of balanced growth. We know what this means. It means primarily curbing inflation while keeping unemployment at a steadily low level. I will say a few words about this as well. Lowering inflation is an important achievement. In late March, it stood at 10.3% on an annual basis. In late June, it was down to 9.4%, and by late July, it was as low as 8.8%. Now, what Putin doesn't say is that it's fallen significantly below that level because currently we are seeing deflation in Russia, falling prices, as is typical in August, just to say. But anyway, Putin went on to say this. The Bank of Russia, in other words, the central bank, estimates that by the end of this year, the consumer price dynamics may be within 6 to 7%, which is lower than forecast. So inflation now is on a rapidly declining trajectory. And then Putin went on to say there are signs of decrease in labour shortages on the labour market. According to surveys also conducted by the Bank of Russia, the share of enterprises with staff shortages is decreasing, which is certainly an important and telling signal. And then Putin went on to say this. Many experts, however, are talking about the emergence of hypothermia. That is, risks that the economy might cool too fast, and even of a recession. We discussed this earlier during our working meetings. We constantly discuss this matter with the governor of the central bank, in other words, with Nabulina. The central bank monitors the situation and works directly with enterprises to assess the situation. It does not see any major risks currently, as I understand it. So no recession this year. Russia flirted with recession in June and July, but the economy is gradually returning to growth. Putin did say that there has been a small uptick in unemployment. Hidden unemployment is growing, meaning that some workers are in so-called downtime, employed part-time, or at risk of being laid off. At the beginning of this year, their number was about 98,000. In late June, 153,000, and up to 199,000 as of August 8th. One has been reading an awful lot in sections, both of the Russian but also some parts of the business media in the West, about lots of people in Russia working part-time now, being put on part-time work because of deteriorating economic conditions. Well, according to Putin, that's 200,000 people in total, which for an economy the size of Russia and for a population in the 100 million working people doesn't seem to me that much. And he says that Putin went on to say that the number of registered unemployed has also increased slightly. At the beginning of the year, it stood at 274,000. In late June, 291,000. In early August, 300,000. And the overall rate of unemployment is 2.2%. Still a historic low. Again, these figures are not really consistent with indicators of a recession or of a significant decline. By the way, Putin didn't mention this, but other figures that have come from Rosstat, the Russian statistical agency, suggest that real wages in Russia have continued to grow this year. So even though there's been a decline in lending, overall living standards have continued to rise. And Putin goes on to say that the federal budget dynamics are stable. Non-oil and gas revenue for the federal budget increased 14% year on year in January to July, amounting to 14.8 trillion rubles. So-called turnover taxes grew by 6.7% in January-July compared to the same period last year. VAT grew by 6.9%. Now, as I understand it, Russia is currently running a budget deficit of around 2.2%. This is despite the fact that oil prices have been low and despite the fact that there's been no compensation for lower oil prices because the ruble has also been very strong. It is currently still trading at below $80 rubles to the dollar. So the fact that budget revenue continues, the budget deficit continues to be under control, despite, as I said, reductions in oil and gas receipts to the budget. That points to something else, which is not only that the economy, many parts of the economy are still growing, but that the fact that non-oil and gas revenue is increasing is undoubtedly a reflection of the tax reform that the Russians carried out about a year and a half ago. So Russian payroll taxes have slightly grown, and taxes at higher rates have grown rather more. By Western standards, they are still very low, but they are enough to ensure that the budget remains, well, if not exactly in balance, that the deficit is still low, that there's still no crisis in the overall budget position. And it also means, and this is perhaps the key thing, that the importance of oil and gas revenue to the federal budget is declining. Again, this isn't something which I think in the West has been widely understood, but Russia is evolving beyond its historical point, the one that it had at the start of the millennium in the early 2000s, when the budget was heavily dependent on oil and gas revenues. Gradually, steadily, incrementally, step by step, it's moved away from that position. I remember that some years ago, about 5-6 years ago, it was pointed out to me, I learned that overall tax revenue in Russia, that the major share of tax revenue in Russia at that time was already payroll taxes. Payroll taxes had already overtaken oil and gas revenue as the main source of income for the government and for regional governments. And I understand that it has fallen, that the share of oil and gas revenue, which at that time was around a fifth, not 50% as whatever it is people think, that has fallen further, and that its total revenue received by the government and regional governments, the so-called combined budget, it's probably now around 15%. If we're talking about the federal government, it's probably between a quarter and a third of revenue, but the federal government, already has increasing means to make up for that. Again, I don't think people get this, and I think that as the years continue, revenue from the oil and gas industry will continue to decline as a major source of revenue, both for the Russian state, for the Russian federal government and local regional governments in aggregate, but for the federal government as well. Just to say. So, in some respects, Russia is becoming a country that is more normal in its economic structures. It borrows, the state borrows domestically in Russian financial markets. They've now evolved to the level where they're able to lend to the government when the government wants to borrow from them. The so-called Russian bonds, OFZs, ruble bonds, which are floated domestically. The government doesn't borrow in externally, taking on debt in other currencies, the sort of thing that leads to debt crises and fiscal crises when the national currency comes under pressure. That isn't the situation in Russia anymore. And the period when the government was over-dependent on the oil and gas industry for its revenue has already passed, and is declining as well. And, well, the economy is gradually changing its balance. It's becoming more domestically driven. Demand is becoming the main driver of demand is increasingly becoming domestic demand and domestic investment, much of which is going into manufacturing and, by the way, into the high-tech industries, which I will discuss in a later program. So a more conventional, more normal economy, one very different from the very distorted and unbalanced economy that it was at the start of the millennium. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say today in my program. There'll be more from me soon. Remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.